Hey guys, my name is Donnie Halupka. I'm currently a master's student under Dr. Calloway and Dr. Flew Hardy. And today I just wanted to go over quickly with y'all about grazing crop residues and why some producers choose to implement it into their operations and just a little bit of the know-how behind how it all works. So first, I just want to dive into why a producer would decide to actually incorporate grazing some crop residue into their operation. And these first 2 points we have here, with it being a low-cost feed source and extending that grazing season, actually kind of coincide with one another. So it's a lot cheaper to throw these calves out onto corn stalks after it's been harvested than it would be to throw them into a dry lot and be supplementing them with some kind of ration or throwing them hay throughout that entirety of the winter whenever our grasses aren't growing anymore. And then our next 2 points as well kind of complement the other. So when we talk about nutrient recycling, when we throw those calves out there on stocks, for example, they're not only uptaking all the nutrients from those stocks, they're actually putting stuff back into the ground via urine and feces. And then lastly, our land use efficiency. So if we got the land, why wouldn't we want to use it to the most efficiency possible? So rather than just using a plot of land solely for farming or solely for grazing, if we can implement those two together, we're actually going to be really benefiting our bottom line as producers throughout because we're getting more efficiency from that land. And this actually decreases our fertilizer costs as well, referring to our third bullet point, because those nutrients that those cattle are throwing back into the ground are actually going to be saving our producers some money in the long run. UNL did a study a while ago where they looked at throwing cows out on corn stalks and how it benefited or hurt the following year's yields. And they found that actually, whenever these cows were turned out on stocks, the following year, whether they planted corn on corn or beans on corn, that they actually found an increase in the yield per acre. So it's really a win-win at the end of the days for a lot of these producers. So just jumping into some key considerations you want to think about before implementing crop residue grazing into your operation. The first one's going to be making sure we read our pesticide labels. This is probably the most important one because there are a lot of pesticides or other things we spray out into our fields that aren't actually labeled to allow animals to graze those fields even after that crop's been harvested. So it's really important to make sure we're reading our labels and knowing what we're spraying in our field before throwing animals out on it, not only to keep our animals safe, but to keep that food supply chain in the utmost regard. And then our next consideration is going to be fencing, making sure we have a way to keep these animals inside. So you can do this by either having a form of permanent fencing, like having barbed wire run around the field, or what a lot of guys in the West will do is they'll hammer in posts and run hot wire around the field and either charge it by some form of solar charging or having some kind of battery units out there to keep that hot wire hot. And it's important to note too, if you choose to do a system like that where you're running hot wire, is that those animals are used to it and respect that hot wire. Because the worst thing is having an animal that doesn't know what hot wire is and getting scared and running through it. But getting cattle accommodated to using that hot wire certainly isn't rocket science. It's just something worth noting. And then next is going to be our water source. So just like you or I, cattle also need water to survive. So making sure that we implement water, either having a trough in the field where we can fill it up and make sure that those animals have constant access to water, or if you're lucky enough to be grazing some kind of irrigated ground that has a pivot, figuring out a way to incorporate that pivot into that water source. And then lastly, I didn't want to throw this on the slide because I didn't want to give you all the wrong idea, but a lot of old timers, whether it be right or wrong, have concerns with compaction in the field. And there's been studies done that show that compaction isn't an issue in fields after animals have grazed the crop residue out there. UNL actually did a 16-year-long study on this one that shows that there is no significant difference in the amount of compaction on cornfields that were grazed by cattle and cornfields that weren't grazed on cattle. I do want to point out one thing they mentioned in that study, though, is that under extreme conditions, we can see a little bit of compaction. So talking extreme conditions, we're talking about in the spring, once that ground's starting to thaw out, and after a period of rain, we can see about 25 pounds of additional down pressure needed to plant into that ground that following year. But it's important to note as well, in the grand scheme of things, 25 pounds of down pressure really isn't that much. And a lot of that just has to do with how dry that top layer of soil is. So before we get too deep in the weeds here with some of these, I just wanted to lay these all out for y'all and let you see what some of the commonly grazed residues are. That first one being corn stalks. This is something that's super common out in the Midwest or in that corn belt area where predominant amount of our corn is grown. But it's something that we can certainly incorporate here in the Southeast because there is still a good amount of corn that's grown down here. And then our next one's going to be our wheat and other cereal grains. So this is one that's not necessarily very common here in Georgia because we don't grow a lot of wheat or other cereal grains. However, this is something that's often incorporated in our plain states like Kansas and Oklahoma. And then next is cotton stalks. And this is something that is most definitely incorporated here in the Southeast because this is where we grow most of our cotton. So we can either graze that cotton stubble after it's been harvested, or in certain scenarios, we can graze failed cotton. And when we say failed cotton, we're talking about cotton that was not actually harvested and is just left standing there in the field. And then lastly, I didn't make a separate slide diving deeper into this one because I didn't find enough scientific information to where I felt comfortable relaying it to you guys and describing it. So I just wanted to dive into peanut and peanut hay here just very briefly. So this is something that's also common in the Southeast because this is where we grow most of our peanuts. However, highlighting some of the issues and benefits of grazing peanuts, the first one is we're able to, just like cotton, graze that harvested peanut in the form of hay, or graze failed peanuts where cattle are out there grazing the vines of the unharvested peanuts. And the vines of unharvested peanuts are actually super nutritional because peanuts are a legume just like alfalfa is. And that goes for the hay as well, which is also very nutrient dense and similar to alfalfa as well. However, some key concerns when we talk about peanut hay is making sure that we are in a good range of our aflatoxin and mycotoxins and making sure we aren't exceeding that to where it becomes a problem for our cattle. And we'll oftentimes see accelerated rates of these toxins in our hay after periods of drought. So getting into our first crop here, talking about our corn stalks. So cattle actually have a preference on what they want to graze first whenever they get turned out onto a field of stalks. And they're going to select for those kernels first, then they're going to make their way to that husk, and then to the ear, and finally the stalk. So I think it's also really important to note here that because they do select for those kernels first, we can still run the risk of acidosis here. So we typically see this in areas where during harvest we have a little bit of spillage, whether that be from the combine to the grain cart or wherever else. So making sure that we avoid having those high concentration of kernels in the field is of the utmost importance. And we can reduce the risk of this as well by incorporating some rotational grazing. And although it's certainly not as common to incorporate rotational grazing when we talk about grazing corn stalks as we would when we talk about grazing a grass pasture, it's something that we can certainly incorporate to reduce that risk of acidosis. But going on with that about how they like to select for that kernel first, this is actually very beneficial to farmers as well because it's going to help us reduce the amount of volunteer corn we see in the stand that following year. So this is going to really benefit our farmers from having to spray that volunteer corn in their fields. And then next, getting into the stocking rate whenever we talk about grazing stalks. So it's typically about 1 cow per acre for 60 to 100 days. And whenever we talk about grazing corn stalks, it's really important to note too that a lot of this can vary depending on yield or shatter loss, just our overall efficiency whenever we harvest this crop. And there are actually calculators out there, UNL has one, where you can put in your yield and all your other numbers into there, and it'll give you a better idea of what your actual stocking rate is for that field. And then lastly, getting into that nutritional value of throwing these cows out on stalks, we see about 52 to 55% TDN, so that amount of energy out there, and then about 5 to 5.5% crude protein. So depending on what kind of cow you're throwing out there in that field, you may have to supplement them with some additional feed stuff. So as getting into our next crop here, I'm just going to briefly touch over wheat because it isn't as a predominantly grown crop down here in the Southeast as it is in some of those western plain states like Kansas and Oklahoma, where it's more of a predominant cash crop out there. But it's still something that's very commonly grazed in those areas of the country. So just to briefly touch over it, when we talk about grazing wheat, we're talking about grazing it in a vegetative state. So when that plant is actually growing, unlike when we talk about grazing corn or cotton, where we're talking about grazing it after that plant's already been harvested, and what we're grazing is that residue that's left on the ground. So when we graze wheat, we typically start grazing it 3 to 6 weeks after it's been planted. So whenever we have about 4 to 6 inches of growth, and then we'll pull those animals whenever that plant starts to form a stem and it starts to head out with seeds at the top of the plant. Wheat is also a very good source of crude protein and energy, which on the flip side of this is where we have to worry some, because wheat can give you some grass tetany concerns, which is whenever we have too low of a blood magnesium level. And this is most commonly occurring in the spring, following cool and cloudy days in about that 45 to 60 degree Fahrenheit range. And because wheat is also so high in crude protein and soluble carbohydrates, we can also see an increase in the amount of bloat that these animals get when grazing wheat. However, we can certainly aid this problem though and try to avoid it from happening by simply giving them some free choice ionophores such as Rumensin or Bovatec, which have both been shown to help decrease that occurrence of bloat. And then when we talk about stocking rate, we typically get about 1 to 2 animals an acre. And then lastly, grazing wheat stubble, which when we talk about stubble, we're talking about after that plant's been harvested, is not as common as it is to graze during that vegetative state. However, there is still some information out there on it, and some producers do implement that, and it's most commonly done in that late summer and fall period. But it's also worth noting too that that wheat stubble is really low in crude protein and energy as a whole, so you're certainly going to need to supplement some additional feed stuff if you choose to graze the stubble. So rounding out our slideshow here with cotton stubble, I want to first reference back to the beginning of the presentation where we talked about pesticide labels and making sure we're aware of what we're actually spraying on the field. And this is because a lot of times when we're growing cotton, a lot of those pesticides that we're spraying aren't actually labeled to allow animal grazing after it's been applied, even after the crop's been harvested. So it's important to make sure we read those labels. And then a lot of times when we just talk about grazing cotton stubble, we're talking about grazing organic cotton. So that's that cotton that hasn't been sprayed with anything. But when we get into our stocking rates of cotton, the old rule of thumb is 1 cow an acre for about 30 to 35 days. However, though, thanks to a lot of increases in technology here with our pickers and how we harvest this cotton, we're a lot more efficient at it than we were 30 years ago. So what this means is that we're actually leaving less residue out on the field. And because we're leaving less residue out there on the field, that means we're not going to be able to stock those cattle out there for as long or as heavy as we would have in the old days whenever those pickers weren't as efficient. But whenever we do turn those cows out there, they're going to be grazing that lint, that seed, and the leaf, which are all really good sources of roughage and fat. However, though, about 1 to 2 weeks after we've turned those cows out there into the cotton field, we're going to have to start supplementing with some hay. And typically in the southeast, we'll supplement with some Bermuda grass hay, as those two nutritionally complement one another very well. And then the last key point I want to bring up here is our gossypol concerns, especially for our young calves. So gossypol is a toxin that, if consumed too much of, can be deadly to the calf. And our younger calves are going to have a lot lower tolerance for that gossypol in comparison to our mature calves. So with our mature calves, we don't necessarily worry about it as much because they're able to have a higher tolerance to it because they're simply a bigger animal. However, though, when grazing cotton, a lot of times people avoid throwing those younger calves out there. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on too was that we can graze failed cotton too. And failed cotton's just whenever we didn't harvest that plant, so that cotton's still out there standing in the field. And we have failed cotton for a couple of different reasons, a lot of which is economically driven, whether prices be too low or you didn't get a good enough yield that year. But whenever we graze failed cotton, it's still a really good source of nutritional value. We get about 15 to 20% crude protein, about 55 to 60% TDN, which is about the same as our average grass hay. And whenever we graze field cotton as well, we actually see an increase in the amount of days we're able to leave those cattle out there on the field. So that's all I have for y'all today. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to this, and I'd like to apologize for definitely going over the time limit here a little bit. But if y'all have any questions, feel more than free to reach out to me, and I can hopefully answer them or at least point you in the right direction. And then lastly, I just want to throw in my sources for y'all to reference here at the end. Again, I appreciate y'all taking the time to listen to this, and I hope y'all have a great rest of your day.